Hello and welcome to class 6 of D21UD, Urban Drainage and Water Supply. Sorry, that's better. So class 6 is split into 4 parts, and what you'll see is that 3 of these parts are relatively substantial. The 4th part is really just the case study, which I've not recorded it yet, but I think it will just take me a few minutes to get through. So if you're studying this online, I would view class 6 as really 2 lots of work. So try to get through 6A and 6B, and then C and D. So I could have almost called them class 6 and class 7. That's what I'm trying to say. So it is a little bit more work, I think, this week. We'll certainly have a bit more time to get through it. So if you remember back to week 1 with the introduction, I spoke about the transition from combined to separate and into sustainable drainage systems, and how SUDS systems are, so sustainable urban drainage systems, are part of a wider move towards us living more sustainably. So the belief is that sustainable urban drainage systems in the long term will cost less to maintain, and also they place less demand on materials, such as concrete and steel, to deliver the same results, and also they're more environmentally sensitive. And I spoke back in the introduction about how these could relate to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which is the graphic you see in the bottom right, of the screen there. And straight away, there's an inconsistency in this slide. I can see that in the title I've called them SUDS, capital S, capital U, capital D, capital S. But then lower down I have called them SUDS, capital S, lowercase u, DS, so sustainable drainage systems. Now, the reason for this is that in Scotland they're known as SUDS with a capital U, so Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems, whereas in England they were defined in law as Sustainable Drainage Systems, S, lowercase u, DS. So apologies for this inconsistency in my slide, which is a bit embarrassing. But it does illustrate that point, which is actually quite useful. And I was going to mention actually that they're called different things all over the world. And on Vision, there's a copy. Oh, it's hard to line up the camera. There's a copy of this paper, which is called SUDS LID, so that's Low Impact Development, BMPs, Best Management Practice, WSUD, so that's Water Sensitive Urban Design, and more, the evolution and application of terminology surrounding urban drainage. And what this paper really talks about is how that terminology has evolved, so sustainable urban drainage systems, and what they're called elsewhere in the world. So in Australia they tend to be called water sensitive urban design. In the EU, to a certain extent, BMPs, best management practices, that's also used in the States, where low impact development, LID, is also used. Now, so it's worth having a look at that paper. Actually, it's quite readable. It's really a review paper, so it's not too technical, which is good. So of course, these systems across the world, although they're called different things, they largely comprise the same elements, and they're about managing runoff and also treating water quality. Now, but people do get annoyed if you say to them that SUDS is just the same as water sensitive urban design, because I think, etc., is because I think where the differences really lie in these approaches is how they interface with the planning process and where they fall in there. So there is an argument that says that SUDS is largely just about, focus on the design of assets and focusing on the design of assets and deploying them, whereas water-sensitive urban design is much more thinking about the whole development and how water is managed. And I think that's because water-sensitive urban design come from Australia, where they suffered for a long time from, at the same time, droughts and floods, depending on where you were in that quite diverse and large country. So that's the difference. But by and large, when it comes to the elements and how they look on the ground, there's a lot of similarities. There was a move to introduce water-sensitive urban design in the UK a few years ago, and this was I think it was largely EECOM, and they worked with Syria on a project which was actually quite successful. And in a lot of ways, if you're quite cynical, what that was really about was rebooting SUDS and getting people to think about SUDS in a more holistic way, because what shouldn't be forgotten is SUDS were really introduced into the UK and in Scotland in particular to deal with water quality problems and less so to do with flooding issues. But as SUDS began to be more adopted in England as an urban drainage tool, the focus, that was part of the Floods Act, and the focus was very much on managing flood risk. And so it felt that things were drifting away from the water quality and the wider amenity benefits. So for that reason, the water-sensitive urban design, when it was promoted in the UK, it was actually quite a useful way of getting people to think again about what SUDS meant. And although there's the WUSUD, as it's called, that approach has lots of benefits. Around that time, I became convinced that actually, even if we didn't go the whole hog with WUSUD and really dive in with both feet, even if it forced us to think about SUDS in a much more rounded way, it would actually be quite valuable. Anyway, I've rambled on too much for the first slide, so apologies for that. So SUDS provide a much more natural approach to managing runoff. And so, as I've just said, when incorporating developments to help prevent increases in flood risk and also manage pollution. And they also can provide direct improvements to amenity and biodiversity. Okay, and there's a picture there of a new development with a swale stroke basin running through the green space in front of it, or part of it. So greenfield runoff. So when rain falls on undeveloped land, we know this from week 1, most of the water will percolate through the soil to the nearest watercourse or groundwater reservoir. Only a small proportion is converted to runoff. So this means that even when you can have quite significant short duration heavy storms, which are the kind of ones that really test your urban drainage systems, there can be very little impact on watercourses because most of that runoff is absorbed. And if you remember, we spoke about how the problem with development is we cover the greenfield land with impermeable surfaces, which reduce the potential for infiltration, and also because they're smooth, the runoff comes over them faster. So the flows in the watercourse tend to peak higher and peak sooner. Okay. And that means that the runoff volume can increase substantially because of development, and due to that you can get increased flood risk and also environmental impacts because of the extra and faster flows in rivers results in erosion and deposition problems, which we'll come to later, I think. Okay, and then the peak flows can increase by up to 10 times. So this graph really just illustrates those points. Now there's three things here. So the green curve is the greenfield runoff rate. So that's pre-development. So that's the kind of shape we might get. Obviously it's different for everyone. The blue curve is where if we're just going for traditional development, and so what we end up with is a higher peak and a peak sooner. And if you look at the area under that graph, it's much larger than under the green one, and that's because there's less infiltration happening. Now, why I chose this diagram is it's also got the red line. And now, so what the red line is that's designing an urban drainage system with attenuation in it. So that's storage basically. So, but there's no infiltration. So we can design a drainage system which is storage, so that the peak flow going to the river is no greater than the greenfield runoff rate. So that means you've not got the extra flow velocities in the river, and there's environmental benefits there because you're not you're less likely to be damaging the environment in terms of the erosive forces of the flows. But if you look at the area under the red curve, what you see is much larger. So that's because it's attenuating the flows, perhaps like a natural catchment would, but it's not allowing any infiltration. So it is possible with a separate system to reduce the peaks if we use storage, but because there's no infiltration, we still get that higher volume. But where we do have higher flows, we increase risk of scour. And now scour is a natural process, and it does happen. It's part of how rivers evolve, and so we shouldn't pretend that it's always a bad thing. But where we have development, that can increase the risk of scour, and so we're interrupting that natural processes there. Where that material is eroded, it's then deposited somewhere, and that could be damaging another environment, another habitat. And we're also increasing flood risk downstream. Now the other issue is that even when we design a drainage system, if we don't allow for climate change or increased impermeability in a catchment because people are doing things like extending their property or paving over their front garden so they can park their car. You see this development, it looks like it's new and it's already allowing people to park their car right where their front garden should be. That can place extra demands on the system, and the belief is that with a conventional system, adding that extra capacity sometime down the line is quite expensive, whereas with a sustainable system it's a bit more adaptable because you're much more focused on dealing with runoff, allowing it to infiltrate basically pretty much where it falls, rather than adding capacity further and further downstream. And touched on this, and on top of that we have to take into account climate change and all the demands that's going to place on drainage systems right across. And I guess the issue here is that with existing drainage networks, we're faced with a choice between, if we're going to accommodate climate change, we're faced with a choice between expanding the capacity of that network, so by and large adding storage, and the cost that comes with, or we can choose to retrofit SUDS systems to our developments to try and intercept those flows so they don't go into the drainage network, so we don't have to provide storage there. And that could be by encouraging people to install permeable driveways rather than impermeable ones where that's possible. I know it's not always possible. That could be by retrofitting things like ponds to parks and green space. People might not always welcome that, of course. And in the States, I think I touched on this in the first week, and I think I've got slides later. In Portland, Oregon, they encourage people to disconnect their roof areas and just discharge that to their gardens, and also they retrofitted bioretention areas in streets, so taking up car parking spaces with basically little basins. And so all these things can be alternatives to adding, reinforced concrete storage tanks below ground, which come at considerable cost and have to be maintained and deliver no direct biodiversity or immunity benefit. Okay, but so the alternative is, of course, we could do nothing, and climate change will just result in more of this. So as I was saying, storage tanks are the traditional solution just to the storage problem, but not perhaps sustainable in the longer run. So how does SUDS change things? So there's just these 4 basic rules, I guess. Runoff from a developed area should not exceed that prior to development. So that's about determining that greenfield runoff rate curve for your development, or the peak flow and volumes, and ensuring the new development doesn't exceed that. So it's about designing your new development so that it tries to replicate as much as possible that greenfield runoff situation. Runoff should not result in any downgrading of the downstream watercourse. Pollution generated by development should be treated within the development area before discharge. Now that word treated there can be a little bit misleading. So that's not about having mini wastewater treatment works dealing with polluted urban runoff from roads, etc. That's really just about attenuating flows and also allowing normally sedimentation to remove the pollutants in the flow. And we have to take into account the wider needs of the community. So what's meant by wider needs there is really amenity and biodiversity. So trying to extract more value from the drainage asset. So traditionally this was, those 4 aims were encapsulated in what was called the SUDS triangle. And the development SUDS triangle is mentioned in the paper actually, I think. It's a Scottish thing. So the 3 elements of the triangle were quantity, quality and amenity. So a really simplistic way of looking at what we've been doing in the course so far is that you can argue that combined systems were focused on quantity, so basically reducing flood risk, but weren't too interested in water quality. And but because of the problems with CSOs, etc., which I'm sure you remember, we moved to separate systems which took into account water quality discharges from networks. And so we had separate foul and surface water runoff systems, and that was about protecting water quality. And to a certain extent, because remembering that urban runoff isn't clean and it does come with substantial pollutants in their own right. And what SUDS have done is moved the drainage conversation on to include, I'm trying to colour in this arrow here, to include amenity, so try to extract that greater value. So hopefully what we've got now with SUDS is something that's in the middle here that tries to balance flood risk, water quality in rivers and amenity for developments. So really simplified story there, but that's one way of looking at it. So water quality is about preventing pollution, water quantity is about flooding, and also to a certain extent low flows, but that's much less of an issue. And then we've got amenity, which is about aesthetics for development, so how the development looks and feels, and also biodiversity, so the range of flora and fauna in those devices. So the SUDS triangle was a great thing, and it was really simple to communicate, but the more recent version of the SUDS manual has replaced it with this diagram, which is just, I think it's hard to get excited about. But but what's good about it and why it is exciting is it divides the amenity part into amenity and biodiversity. And for me, what that means is that it's about recognising that quite often SUDS do provide amenity. So you've got nice landscaped areas which could also be used to manage flows, which is a good thing, but they don't necessarily provide biodiversity. Well, biodiversity is not necessarily maximised. So they're about much more. They can be. You can choose to have ones which are highly landscaped and you invest quite a lot in their maintenance, or you can go towards ones which are perhaps a bit more naturalised and you're much more focused on biodiversity. Now, but biodiversity can be a difficult thing to communicate to residents. By and large, they're happy if a duck arrives in their SUDS pond, and that's the marker for biodiversity. That's a very UK focused statement, but by and large, ducks will land in just about any water body above a certain size, and it's really about the wider ecology when you're thinking about diversity. And it's not just about ducks; it's about the smaller animals and also the plants, etc., which exist in the pond. So it's important to take a much wider view of what biodiversity really means. So this has changed the way developments look. So rather than in this example here, rather than the road discharge into the pipe, what you see is a road discharges to this swale and down through that outlet. And what that means is that, so the benefit straight away is you're not digging a trench to bury a pipe and then worry about whether that pipe's going to block or not, because if it does block, it's going to be quite expensive to unblock. What you've got is a swale device which is almost impossible to block, and if there are any issues with it, they can be quite quickly dealt with. This type of approach as well means that local residents perhaps feel more engaged in how it's managed. I'm not saying that they should look after it, but quite often local residents will do things like, if they've got paint they don't need anymore, or less likely these days, but in the past, if they were changing the engine oil in their car, that's something I know how to do, or would even think about figuring out, they would put the excess oil down the drain now or the unwanted paint. But with this approach, you basically can't do that, because the oil and the paint just appears in your local swale, and it doesn't look very nice at all. So things are much more visible, so people hopefully buy into that. This is beside the Park and Ride at Heriot-Watt University's Edinburgh campus. This was a few years ago, and this is when this it's a series of these basins which cascade down. This is when they were first constructed, and an effort was made to keep them quite well maintained. And so you can see that the grass has been mown around this one back then. After a couple of years, they took a decision to stop maintaining it in this way, and it now looks much more natural, which is a good thing. And it's also good for the council, because it means they don't have to spend money maintaining it. But the downside is that they seem to spend absolutely no money maintaining it, so it's a bit of a litter trap. So whilst it's fully naturalised, and it looks, there's lots of well-established plants living it now, quite big ones actually, there's also quite a lot of litter which just lingers there. And two other things about this one, I always like to have a moan about this one. It's very close to the edge of the road, as you can see, and that brings two problems. It's actually quite difficult to maintain it if you're going to use a vehicle to do anything, because to the left of this picture there's a fence, which is where the Park and Ride is, and to the right you can see there's a road approaching the junction. So it's hard for a vehicle to park up, for guys to get out, to remove the litter, etc. So they're left walking up the verge. The other issue is, if you look at the steepness of the slope and how close it is to the road and how potentially deep it could get, I think there is a risk that a car could go off the road and into it, and somebody could have quite a stressful time trying to get out their car. So I think there's a number of issues with this one, and I think it's fair to say that the City Council recognise this SUDS scheme is not being a particularly good one for all those reasons. But don't say I said that. A basin beside this development. This looks quite good. Basins are basically, I'll touch on this later, basins are basically ponds which are dry between rainfall events, so they're designed to fill up, and then when the rainfall event is passed, they'll either infiltrate flows or they will slowly pass them downstream. Eagle-eyed people will spot that this development also has rainwater butts, which is quite good. If you look at the size of the rainwater butt compared to the size of the roof of the house, it's actually quite small. If the rainwater butt was empty, it would just take a few millimetres of rainfall to fill that up, which is fine. So they might use the water from that to water their garden over the summertime, which is fine. But pretty much once you get past September in the UK, that'll be full, and it will remain full probably until April, May time, because there's no use really for water in the UK context over the winter time certainly for use in a garden. We installed one of these in our previous property, and without really thinking too much about it, but it did stay full most of the time, because unless you've got a use for it, and we're not crazy gardeners, the thing just rapidly fills up and it remains full, and once it's full there's no benefit really from it, because in the UK they have to be designed to overflow back into the drainage system. There is ones coming on the market which are available, but are a bit more complex, and what they do is they fill up during rainfall events, and then once the rainfall event passes, they slowly trickle the water back into the drainage system, which is good. So that means there's more of a chance of it having at least some capacity at the start of the rainfall event, so it takes the pressure off your network. A basin here beside a roundabout in Dunfermline. I always think this is quite a good one, because it's perhaps not the best place to build houses, although there's houses at the other three corners, so it's kind of a good use of space. I touched on this one right at the start, back in the introductory class. There's actually 4 SUDS devices here. There's a basin upstream, and then you've got the water flow goes from the basin into the first pond, onto the second one, and then onto the third, before being discharged. The idea here is each step of that process gives a chance for sediments to settle out. So as it goes downstream, hopefully the water quality improves, which is good. But you can see here a big issue with such schemes everywhere is if you look at the amount of space those ponds and basin take up, the housing developer would much rather build houses there, because you can sell houses but you can't sell the ponds to anybody at great cost. This is a SUDS scheme in my hometown of Kirkcaldy in Fife, and I think the pond on the lower right, there's another picture of that one later in this class I think, or certainly I'll try to remember to point it out here when we come to it. And what's interesting about, well, it's not really interesting, but it's what's noteworthy about this scheme is here you've got really 2 developments. One looks like it's feeding this pond, and the other looks like it's feeding this pond. So the sort of textbook SUDS pond is often at the centre of a development, in a shared community space where people can come together and it adds value. Yeah. More realistic, this setting is probably more common where it's at the edge of a development, and why it's at the edge of a development often is because exactly what's happening here in Kirkcaldy is the development's on a hill, so the development has to, the water has to drain down the hill to the pond. If it was in the centre of the development, say here, the water would basically have to be pumped up to the pond, which is just never going to happen. So whilst it's always a good aspiration to have the pond in that kind of shared space in the middle of a development, it's not always possible. Actually, there's the shared space there. Looks like there's a play park. By far the most common type of SUDS is probably permeable paving systems in the UK, and why these are so common is because they don't take up any space. So in your development, you're going to have car parking spaces, so you can have, they can be asphalt with zero permeability, or you can have permeable paving with, you know, basically 100% permeability. So as a developer, it's quite a good low-cost way of installing SUDS devices. The question is, of course, we can use them to, if you think back to the SUDS triangle, or the quadrangle, if that's what it is, we can use these things can reduce water flood risk, can improve water quality, but unless you like geometric patterns of concrete blocks, because that's what they are, really what amenity value do they really provide? You know? And are they sustainable? I mean, concrete has quite a high in carbon footprint, and these devices have a life cycle of probably 20 years or so. And these devices, these SUDS ponds are in Edinburgh, so the two on the right, are down on Edinburgh's waterfront at Granton, next to the gas holder, which is recently been sold to a developer. So we'll see houses springing up here soon, which will be interesting because the gas holder's listed. I was going to say more about the gas holder, but I won't. And on the left, we've got a SUDS pond in an area of Edinburgh called Firhill, which is an area of relatively high social deprivation in Edinburgh. And I think, in any context, I think this is quite a nice asset. It looks good, and you can see the duck there. As I said, they're everywhere, and this does add a bit of value, I think, to the local community in terms of amenity. So when we compare SUDS schemes to conventional drainage systems, one of the key differences, and hopefully you've picked up this one already, is just the sheer diversity of different approaches you can take that, to a certain extent, flexibly work with the kind of development you've got. So if you're in a high density, city centre area, you're much more focused on permeable surfaces for car parks and roads if you can. If you're in a suburban area, you've got much more space to work with because land perhaps has less value. So you can do things with ponds and landscaping around them, which is quite powerful. It's not just the conventional system where basically you've got pipes, manholes and tanks to deal with. There's much more flexibility here, and there's a lot more opportunity, I hope you see, to add extra value to the development. So the urban drainage system isn't something that's below the ground under a manhole cover. It's something that is part of the community and people value and enjoy, if that's the word. So it tends to be we install SUDS schemes in what's called treatment trains, and the idea here being that the more SUDS devices the flow goes through, the more it's treated. So so here there's really three elements to this. So you've got source control, which is basically trying to deal with the rainfall where it falls. So that could be a permeable paving surface, so the water falls on that surface, and that's it. It's the end of the story for that rainfall, because it's infiltrated. Well, it infiltrates into that, and hopefully discharges to groundwater if that's the way it's been designed. Excess flows from your surfaces, from your roofs, etc., could be conveyed to a site control, which may be a swale, which then discharges to regional control, which is a pond. So it could be that you're, so first of all, you've got a permeable surface. Once that capacity is there used up, it goes to your swale, which conveys the flows. There'll be a lot of infiltration there, hopefully. Any flows that's not infiltrated, that then goes to your regional control, which might be a pond. And those three steps, if that's what you have, hopefully each of them along the way is reducing the volume and attenuating the flows and improving water quality and providing some amenity along the way. Now, the number of steps you have in your treatment train, though, should reflect. So by and large, it's assumed. The original SUDS design, it was about assuming that the more treatment train steps you have, the better. But work we've done here and work that's been done elsewhere showed that that's not always necessarily the case. You can have some treatment trains which have lots of devices in them, which perhaps are less effective than others, or you can have a SUDS system, which is basically a pipe network collecting flows from urban surfaces, which discharge into a single pond. And a well-designed pond can actually do a fantastic job of removing pollutants from your flows. But the problem is that if you allow just a single pond to do all the work for you, it means all the pollutants end up in that pond, which means the pond itself might not be able to deliver the biodiversity benefits that you want because it's moderately polluted. So what I'm saying is, the treatment train has to be fitted to the pollutant risk, and also you also have to think about the amenity you want to get from your treatment train. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but what the table on the left shows is typical pollutant concentrations from urban surfaces, and below that in the table you see the typical remediation rates from different SUDS devices. So when you're designing your treatment train, what you have to do is estimate the pollution level coming from your surfaces, then have a think about the ability of your suggested treatment train to remove them, and then compare what you expect the resultant outflow to be to the receiving water quality, because obviously you don't want to pollute that water course, you don't want to discharge to that higher pollutant levels than are already there, ideally, and then repeat that process if the output from your treatment train is, in terms of pollutants, is too high. So it's really just about, like I say, the old system used to be about just purely numbers of treatment train elements, but now it's much more about matching up your elements with your expected pollutant levels. So it's that simple, as it says in this slide. So surface water should be returned to the natural environment as soon as is reasonable. Design should start by preventing problems from arising in the first place. So that's about source control, and it's also having to think about the surfaces you have in your catchment and the pollutants that are building up on them, and are you taking reasonable steps to remove those pollutants. So in residential areas, all you can do is take reasonable steps, the street cleaning, etc., which should be happening in developments anywhere. But that step is much more about dealing with commercial industrial premises. How are you managing the pollutants there, and are you doing the best you can to stop them from entering the water course? Hopefully you are. And you're also trying to minimise the use of impermeable surfaces. So the bottom line is what it says there at the bottom, is that if the water's not contaminated, you don't have to clean it up. And if you remember back to the previous slide, if your runoff quality, if you can improve your runoff quality at the start, it means you have to invest less in your treatment drain to clean it up. This talks through the source controls, which I think I have already touched on. And then on to regional controls, which again I've run through. And so we'll come back to this SUDS scheme in the case study in class 6D. I hope I've not recorded it yet, but that's the intention. But this is quite a good SUDS scheme here. You've got, you can see you've got a drain here that to a certain extent serves that car park. That's my old car. With this discharged into this quite small pond, I think some people call it a wetland, so wetland stroke pond. That pond then discharges into the swale, and then the swale discharges into the this quite substantial pond. Now, this SUDS treatment train is much more complex than that, but what you see here is basically a good summary of it. You've got, and what I've shown you there is, in this quite basic summary of it, what you've got here is 4 elements. You've got runoff from the car park going into the drain. Well, 5 if you include the grass surface, which you could say is a filter strip. So you've got water coming off the car park into the drain, into the wetland, down the swale, and into the pond. So through each of those 4 steps, there's a chance for the water to infiltrate into the ground, and there's a chance for sediments to be removed, either through being filtered out by the grass or through siltation in the pond. Okay, so quite a positive story there. Obviously there's much more flow inputs to this treatment drain than just that small car park. It takes flow from the roads, etc. as well, and from building roofs and all the rest of it. But I think this treatment train by and large does a good job, and we'll come back to it in class 6D, so you can look forward to that. On the catchment in Edinburgh we have SUDS schemes, and I've already touched on them, so I won't dwell on this. I spoke earlier about how in the introductory lecture how I was in Portland a couple of years ago. We went to see this school, teacher's car park in this school playground. And what they did was they added what are called these bioretention areas around that car park in space. And the idea being is you've got quite a big impermeable surface here. Flow from the car park, rainfall from the car park goes into these bioretention areas and is absorbed there. So you've got quite a big area there. You're stopping that water from getting into the drainage system, so it's reducing the pressure in the drainage system, and it's giving you some real amenity in your school playground, which is a really positive thing. And I'm sure at certain times of the day, not when this picture was taken, it's also providing some shade for the cars. So win-win there, I think. And I think I spoke earlier about retrofitting SUDS. I think this is a great example of where that can work. The same school, and I think the same school, and I've got a picture of it, but not to hand, is there's a part of the school that was shaped a little like that. Okay, and in this area here, really should change colour, but it was just a piece of playground, so you had a black asphalt surface, and around that piece of playground you had classrooms, which is what you would expect because it's a school. And so as part of this, the retrofit programme, what they did was they converted this, and I will change colour now just to really emphasise this point. I'll have to move this a bit there. Oh, goodness. It's not letting me change colour. There we go. Don't get too excited about the colour change. So what they did was they retrofitted SUDS to the square, and it became like and there was it wasn't a huge area, and it became like a little garden, little pathways through it for the kids to play in during their break time. But there was also like an area for rainfall from the car park, from the playground, sorry, to infiltrate into this area. And so it was like actually quite a pleasant space, and it had the look of a space that, although there was quite a lot of plants and things there, it looked well trampled by the kids as well. So you could see it was an area the kids like playing in, so that's positive. But the additional unexpected benefit was that because rather than having a car park space between these classrooms that had this green space, is that the teachers in the 3 classrooms, oh my goodness, 1, 2, 3, there we go, they said that they found their classrooms to be a little bit cooler in the summertime. So win-win, win. So I think that's really positive. And again, just come back, I mean, if you come back to the amenity benefit here, the other way of solving this problem would have been to install a tank below the school playground, reinforced concrete storage tank perhaps, which discharged to the drainage network after the storm had passed. Quite substantial cost, but you wouldn't have got any additional benefits in terms of the cooling in the classrooms, which I admit was unquantified, but they did say it was happening, and also the amenity benefits for the kids in the playground, and the cooling of the cars, if that really does happen. But yeah, so an example of how the such schemes can provide those additional benefits, and into the longer term as well. I spoke about this earlier. This is the installation of bioretention areas in streets. So on this area here would have been, these are largely built in where cars were parking. So a bit of consultation with residents saying we're going to move a couple of car parking spaces from your street. We're going to use it to absorb runoff. They just come along and install these things, off they go, and they tend to work. What's interesting about them is the council took the view that they wouldn't design these on an individual basis. They just had a standard design, and they just went out and did it. And the belief was if they did enough of them, they would start to get real impact. And I think that's really positive. In some areas, residents have really taken ownership of them, even though there's litter in this one, which isn't good. And what they did was actually pulled out the plants the council had installed, because obviously the council was interested in plants that are probably slow growing, so they don't have to maintain them very much, and probably ones that spread out horizontally so they stop weeds coming through. And what some residents were doing was putting their own plants in to make it actually look a bit better and looking after that area. And when we were there, we found one person who wanted to plant vegetables in it, and I'm not sure I liked the idea of vegetables that had been watered from road runoff, but each to their own, I guess. Right, so I'm going to give you another SUDS in action story. This is a pond on the Edinburgh campus, Hertford University. I quite like this picture, I took it a few years ago. And I've run through this before in introductory, so it's about the park and ride scheme. So this is the Edinburgh campus. Right now, let me get this right, otherwise it's embarrassing. I'm in this building there, right in that building there. So that's the Arrow building, Heriot Walk campus, if you're an ideal student. So a few years ago, the council decided to build a park and ride scheme beside the campus. So a park and ride is where people who would normally drive all the way into Edinburgh, instead, so they're commuting from a town outside Edinburgh, they instead drive to the park and ride site, they park their car for free, and then they get a bus into town. The bus, they have to pay for the bus. Right now, the bus is £1.70 for a trip that probably takes around 45 minutes or so into town. So the idea is that you don't have, as a driver, you don't have the stress of driving all the way to town and finding an expensive car parking space. You do the park and ride thing. So this was built on a farmer's field some years ago now. So there is, as you can see, that it was basically built on a site that looks like that, and a new roundabout was created there, and we created a new roundabout there. But well, anyway, let's not get too. I was going to get hung up on the exact dimensions of it. But what we see is that there's a burn cutting through the field there, and that's in the picture on the right. So what they tried to do with the park and ride scheme was design it so there was no negative impact on the burn. So if you're not from Scotland, burn is just a name for a small river. So here it is. Here's the park. Here's the field before the park and ride was built. You can see there's a fish in the river. I believe the fish is a cod, which is quite unusual in a Scottish river. So before we built the park and ride, when it rained, water just infiltrated into the ground by and large, and there was some runoff. When we built the park and ride, if we built the park and ride without SUDS, the water would have just discharged to the river. The river would have flooded more frequently, and the fish would have been a bit upset. But using a SUDS scheme, we still have the same park and ride building more or less, but the runoff from it and the car park discharges to a SUDS scheme, which is represented by this basin, and then from there it infiltrates. So there's no added flood risk for the fish. So the fish, unless the fish looks out the water, which I don't think it really does that much, it doesn't know the park and ride scheme's there, because there's no extra flow coming into the river, hopefully, and there's no extra pollutant load coming in either. So it's oblivious. Sustainable. And so that's what happened. The car park surface is made from impermeable pavement, where there's spaces between the blocks for the water to percolate through. That water then goes into these basins at the side of the road, which these are the ones I showed you earlier. And then once this basin is full, it goes to the next, and then once that basin is full, it then goes across the road, well, under the road, into the river, and the fish is quite happy. So that's about. So it's about. So coming back to the point I was making earlier, and through that park and ride scheme, we were able to have a development which perhaps looks the same as any other development, any other park and ride development, but it's drained in that sustainable way, which means there's reduced environmental impact. And that's really what they're about. And for a park and ride scheme, it's a pretty utilitarian development, but SUDS are about providing, about draining developments to manage the flood risk and improve water quality, and also improve amenity, like we see with this picture here. There is people who don't like the idea of living next to a pond like this because they're concerned that their kids might have an accident in it, and that's something we have to think about quite carefully. But by and large, most people want to live near something like this because of the extra value it provides. This is the one in Kirkcaldy, which I showed you the aerial photograph of earlier, the one which was built on a hill. At the time this one was constructed, there was concern about kids going into the pond and having an accident, so the council put this steel railing all the way around it, and you can just see at the edge of the picture here. Then there was a barrier of prickly bushes, and then beyond that was a second steel railing. So the idea was that the two steel railings and the prickly bushes would stop kids from going into the pond and having an accident. Now, a couple of things that's interesting about that is if you were a 10-year-old kid and you're able-bodied, would two railings and prickly bushes stop you from getting into the pond? Probably not. Would it make it harder for you to get out if your friend was having a problem? Probably would. What we surveyed people here and also next to similar ponds, and they felt that living next to a pond like this did have its risks, which is concerning. But when you spoke to people who live next to ponds that didn't have railings, they didn't really perceive them as being high risk. So it seemed that, you can argue this is a good thing, of course, it seemed that all these railings did was really raise concerns among residents about the risks the pond posed, rather than, and you can argue that's a good thing, of course, because we should always be aware of risks, but perhaps if you're making people unduly concerned, then that's not necessarily a good thing. You could just see at the edge of the picture here, there's a road, there's some cars going along when I took this picture. It's my view that that's a much bigger risk to kids that live in these houses than a pond. I think the number of people who drown in urban areas in the UK in each year is a tiny little number, and I think the vast majority of them, believe it or not, drown in their baths. But the number of people who are killed or injured on roads is absolutely unacceptable. And I think that's where the real risk lies. When we go to, not far away from here is a recreational park with quite a large boating pond in it, where you can hire a rowing boat and go around. There's no railing round it. Kirkcaldy is a coastal town. You can go down to the harbour, you can see the boats coming in. You can walk along the seafront, along the seawall, along the beach, and there's no real railings there. So I think we have to be aware of risks, aware of the risks that SUDS ponds can present, and we have to think carefully about how we design them. So most ponds are designed with sloping entries to them. So right around the edge of this pond, it should be sloped going underwater, so that if there's no sudden steps, so if kids do decide to wade in, they're not suddenly, they don't suddenly find themselves in deep water. And that has the added benefit of helping little animals get in and out as well. So yeah, we have to be aware of the risks, but we have to try to put them into context, and we shouldn't be too alarmist about them. At the time, there was quite a lot of time spent on talking about the risks that these ponds posed in Kirkcaldy and other places, and it's a shame we didn't really spend as much time talking about the other risks in urban areas, not least from cars. So some things about SUDS. I just talked about recreational ponds. SUDS are new. We've had ponds in urban areas for a long time that were used to manage rainwater. This is Blackford Pond in Edinburgh, just at the edge of Morningside. Anybody that lives in this area knows that when it rains, this pond really fills up, and that's because that was its job. It was to try to stop water impacts downstream, and it's been around for a long time. SUDS aren't necessarily British, they're used all over the world. I think the first ones I came across, were in Scandinavia, but they were very much for, showcase untypical developments which were really focused on ecology and sustainability. And what's been really good is that quite early on there was movement in the UK to move towards SUDS, and I think Scotland was one of the very first countries to make them compulsory, which I think is a really positive thing, and it's something I'm really proud of. You can argue about how compulsory was, and whether or not other countries are doing better than us now. But I think that was a big step at the time. But you shouldn't really view these as a British thing. I think they're all over the world. Both these pictures are in Australia, and if you remember the paper I mentioned earlier, I don't know why I mention this all the time. They are used all over the world, in the States and across Europe, etc. They don't have to take up space either, SUDS, because remember we spoke about permeable paving, don't take up any space, and if you've got a green roof, which we'll cover in the next class, class 6B, they don't take up any space either. So they don't have to take up space. You can tell that to your developer. And green roofs have been around for a while as well. This one's in Portugal. Trees on the roof of this building help keep the upper levels cool through shading. Not sure about the wind loading now. So I just want to end this just by reminding you that SUDS are part of a transition, and I think it's a transition we're nearing the end of. So quite a lot of the urban estate we drain still has the kind of drainage network which is illustrated in this diagram here, a combined network which flows from foul water inputs and surface water inputs mixed together, and where these overflow, they'll go into the urban environment via CSOs. So the step away from that after the Second World War was to move towards surface water, so separate drainage systems where the surface water drained to a separate pipe. These were an improvement, but resulted in quite a lot of surface pollutants from urban surfaces making their way into rivers. And if you look at how road traffic levels have increased over that time, that's had non-trivial impacts on receiving water quality in quite a lot of towns and cities, which is unacceptable. And the last step in the transition has been to go towards sustainable urban drainage systems, where it's much more about dealing with that water quality problem and dealing with the runoff at a much more local level. So it does feel that, even over the space of my career, when I graduated in 1992, there's been a huge shift away from combined and separate systems towards sustainable urban drainage systems, being at the core of what we do. And I think where we get this right, it changes the nature of developments to be much more green and have a much more amenity value associated with them. And I hope some of the pictures I've showed you in this week's class emphasise the additional benefits that you can get from SUDS schemes. But it does seem like we're nearing the end of that transition. It's difficult to see, from going from combined to separate to SUDS schemes, to me they're three huge steps. And it's hard to see that in the future there's another big step ahead of us. It's about optimising the designs we've got for such schemes now going forward. And I think a huge challenge we'll face, over the remainder of my lifetime probably, is looking at how we retrofit SUDS in particular to existing urban developments to try to reduce the flood risk and water quality impacts, and hopefully provide a little bit of amenity as well. So I think that's a huge challenge over the coming years. I'm not sure we're ever going to get developments quite as green as the one in the cartoon picture here, or buildings that look quite so hairy with greenery, if that's a way of describing it. But I think things are moving in the right direction. And almost surprised myself with this slide. And we shouldn't forget about this is about urban drainage systems playing their part in delivering, a more sustainable form of urban development. The UN's Sustainable Development Goals are here just now, and people are talking about them. But I think that once we've moved on to something else, I think some form of these goals will still be around, and I think urban drainage systems will still be contributing to them. Okay, so that ends Class 6A. I hope you found it quite interesting. It's one of the, as I go through the classes, it's one of the ones I enjoy doing most, and I hope that's been evident to you. I put a lot of effort into putting these videos together, so I hope you do appreciate them. But I still do recognise that they probably raise just as many questions as they do answer. So please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions. And I'll see you soon for Class 6B. Bye for now.